This is a brief presentation to show some of the evidence that we'll present at trial regarding the liability of the defendants in this matter. As you know, our client Jimmy Moore was injured in a car accident on August 8, 2011, which left him quadriplegic. Based on the testimony of the driver of the subject vehicle and a witness traveling behind Jimmy, there's no question but that the tire that caused the accident came from a GM truck, driven by Anthony Ross. The witness, Ron Gillian, testified that the tire bounced as high as 25 or 30 feet into the air, and that it would have struck Jimmy's car had he not swerved to avoid it. That is also consistent with the testimony of Anthony Ross. Jimmy's car rolled multiple times and landed upside down, and when Ron found Jimmy, he was upside down in the vehicle, belted in, with his scalp hanging off of his head. As we all know, the tire fell after a cable on the Model 278 spare tire hoist broke, releasing the tire onto Interstate 85 in Spartanburg. The 278 hoist featured a urethane damper, floating ferrule, and an anti-reverse pawl to prevent the cable from winding back on itself. As I'm sure you're aware, GM had problems with the spare tire hoist long before the subject vehicle was produced in December of '95. In October of 1994, a test incident report noted a missing spare tire during an inspection. The TIR noted that the spare tire was stowed off center, became loose, and that the movement then caused abrasion to the cable. This is, of course, a mechanism we're going to see in the incident reports and instances to come. At that point, no action was taken by GM. Another TIR in March of 1995 found a frayed cable in the area of the floating ferrule, and again, no action was taken. Then, in August of 1995, two more incidents occurred, one releasing the spare tire. At this point, Alex Rivera had taken over as the release engineer, and he diagnosed the problem. There's insufficient cable tension that allowed the floating ferrule to rub on and abrade the cable. Now, at this point, Mr. Rivera realized he had a problem, and so as he testified in his deposition, he drove over to the proving grounds and demanded to look at the trucks that were in testing with a 278 hoist. He found 3 trucks with frayed cables. Every one of them was from abrasion wear caused by floating ferrule. Of course, the genesis for these 3 test incident reports in October of 1995. So Mr. Rivera came up with a fix. EWO ABP1Z was issued, and in his words, quote, issued to correct the cable wear problem. He further noted that the floating ferrule and the neoprene damper were the main contributors to the cable wear. Now, the new part was already in use in the off-road version of the truck, and as Rivera noted, that design, quote, does not have a cable breakage problem. So in this matter, questions about reasonable alternative design resolved for us, because this design came off an existing GM vehicle. The EWO was then issued, and one of the reasons why the change is required is to reduce cable breakage, and it was done at a minimal cost. And Rivera noted in his deposition that once this EWO and this fix was put in place, that resolved the cable breakage problem. But here's the trick. Even though Mr. Rivera diagnosed the problem back in August of 1995 and entered the EWO in November of 95, GM chose to continue installing the defective 278 hoist on its vehicles. And so in December of 1995, the subject vehicle was manufactured utilizing the 278 hoist. Now, GM admits that if the 278 hoist tire is not tightly stowed, then the cable will abrade on the floating ferrule, fatigue, and break. And, quote, the spare tire could then fall into the road, close quote. GM wrote this letter in 1997, over a decade before this accident happened. So how much looseness is a problem? Well, according to Alex Rivera, any looseness is a problem. If a tire is stowed properly, according to Mr. Rivera, there's going to be zero movement. And in fact, when asked about a tire that is not 100% secured under a vehicle, Mr. Rivera responded, quote, as long as there is movement on it and there's bending on the cable, I could not guarantee that it would stay together. Now, the law in South Carolina, of course, is that a product is defective if it's unreasonably dangerous under a foreseeable use. So, is it foreseeable that a tire might be stowed with any looseness, any movement? Well, in November of 1995, as part of his investigation into the tire incidents at the proving grounds, Alex Rivera went to the Linden assembly plant, and his words, quote, to root cause the spare tire hoist cable breakage. And he took note of the installation process, and he noticed, quote, that during the spare tire installation, sometimes tires swing, causing the spare tire to become stowed out of position, or the retainer plate does not seat properly. He checked 7 vehicles at the end of the line, and 3 of them had loose spare tires. Mr. Rivera concluded in that email, based on my observations, the installation of the spare tire does not guarantee the spare tire to be properly stowed. Dura employees also noted problems with the spare tires at the GM Spring Lake plant during a visit in February of 1996. They found that the installers were having problems being able to seat the wheel plate in the center of the tire rim due to the rounded edge. They noted that the operator thinks that it's secure, but then it later shifts, causing looseness. So we know that the operators at the GM plants, whose job it was to install these spares, who were trained in this, couldn't do it consistently. We also know that a number of tires were loose at the testing grounds from the TIR reports we looked at earlier. And of course, who was installing those tires? Well, it was GM personnel. Those were either coming from the factory or they were being put on by GM personnel at the testing grounds with prototype engineers. So again, the folks who are trained to do it aren't able to do it. And we discussed how Rivera and Dura representatives noted the difficulty in seating the wheel plate and instances of stowing the cable off center. But Rivera even further discussed the difficulties of installing a spare tire, explaining that when he's done it, the spare tire wobbles while it's being raised and that you have to use your hand to guide it as you raise it. And of course, that's particularly difficult if you're on something other than a flat surface. And of course, the folks at the factory are on a flat surface. So given that the GM personnel, whose job it was to install these tires, who had training in that, they were having trouble keeping the spare tires tight and installing them correctly, you'd then suspect that consumers were too, and you'd be right. GM's survey in Montreal found that 7 of 32 tires checked were loose. That's 22%. And GM has similar surveys from other areas in Canada. And in its March of 1997 letter, GM claimed that the consumers were getting it right. And in support of that, they cited warranty data and they cited a lack of accident reports. But the warranty numbers collected prior to that letter showed that GM already had hundreds of warranty claims on vehicles with the 278 hoist. And the warranty data compiled in 2000 show numerous warranty claims for broken and missing parts. And moreover, GM admitted in an internal memo that though the owner's manual instructions were, in its opinion, adequate, some consumers needed, quote, more explicit instructions to note the proper methods to maintain and inspect their spare tire hoists and cable assemblies. And so they issued a notice. But rather than send those instructions out to all consumers, GM only sent those to consumers in Canada. It's also worth noting that all parties have had trouble finding a 278 hoist that isn't broken or frayed, and none have found a hoist with a functioning urethane damper. Our experts have found 6 278 hoists. Every single one of them has a broken or a frayed cable. Three of those exemplars have frayed cables, and 3 are broken entirely, including one that a consumer tried to rig up. All are consistent with the break on the subject vehicle hoist. We learned at Mr. Hakom's recent deposition that even General Motors has had trouble obtaining any without frayed cables, and one of the exemplars GM has a frayed cable. Mr. Hakom has other exemplars that he says appear to be fine, but he has pointedly not chosen to look at those under a microscope or any sort of lab setting, just sort of giving it an eyeball test. Finally, I noted earlier that in its March 1997 letter, GM cited a low number of accident reports relating to the hoist as evidence that the consumers know how to properly stow and maintain the tire. And GM has stood by that in the depositions. The representatives and employees who've been deposed have said this tire is safe if there's no movement, and we're confident, based on all the warranty data and accident reports and all, that the consumers know how to do this right. We've talked about that already, but put all that aside and consider the fact that GM has hundreds of consumer complaints relating to broken hoists, including many that fell into the road, and some of which caused accidents. We've spoken to a number of these consumers who will testify at trial that they called to warn GM against the very thing that happened to Jimmy. But there are also numerous documented complaints. The spare tire fell off and was run over by another vehicle. While driving on the road, the spare tire came off and bounced down the road. Driving and the spare tire broke and the tire fell off for the second time. This person's concerned that this will come off while the vehicle's driving down the highway. The spare tire's fallen off 3 times, though he's never physically changed a tire on the vehicle. The tire bracket failed. Fell off for the second time. Feels this must be a defect and wants to document the concern. Cable snapped. Cable broke. This one says that the dealer has told him they've seen a lot with this concern. Fell off for the second time. Fell off. This gentleman had a friend whose tire broke. Then he checked his own and found that the spare tire was gone. Driving down the road and it broke and fell into oncoming traffic. Owner wants the concern documented. Driving on a highway and the spare tire separated from the vehicle. Fell off while driving down the road, feels this is a defect. Cable broke. Spare tire fell off. While driving on a highway, it fell off. He's concerned for the safety of others. Tire fell off. He wants the company to be aware of a potential problem. He's concerned should this happen to someone while traveling on the highway. Feels this is safety related as it could have come off on a highway. Vehicle lifted up in the back just as happened with Mr. Ross. Driving and it fell off, feels as a safety concern. Should not happen. Hasn't even used the spare and it broke off. He's worried about this being a safety issue. Cable broke. He's concerned that the spare tire may fall off while on the highway. States that someone may be injured if the spare tire falls off on the highway. Driving when it fell off. Tire should not fall off, says it's a safety concern. If he'd been driving on the highway, it really could have caused an accident. Wants this documented for the safety of others. Fell off for the second time. Wants a final fix so it won't happen again. Concerned about the safety of other people when this happens. There are over 2,000 documents in GM's discovery relating to complaints of broken cables, missing tires. This is just a sampling of those. In short, we're going to be able to make a strong case at trial to hold the defendants liable for what happened to Jimmy. The evidence you've seen, most of it from GM employees, shows that GM knew that the hoist was defective. Alex Rivera knew that the hoist was defective. Mr. Rivera spells it out over and over again in writing. He says exactly how this happened, how this hoist caused the cable to break. He came up with the fix, and he testified that the fix resolved the issue. But despite that knowledge, and despite the fact that people kept calling, kept telling GM that this was dangerous, that tires were falling off of cars, GM did nothing. Many of these folks, as you've seen, who called, said, "Can you imagine what will happen if this falls off on the highway? Can you imagine if it hits something?" Of course, Jimmy and Jamie Moore, they don't have to imagine. They live it every day. And at trial, a jury won't have to imagine. They'll just have to look across the courtroom.